Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here with us this early evening. We also have about 100 folks registered for our live stream. So yeah, really excited to have everyone here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, we're here today on this crucial time to discuss big tech's agenda for international trade agreements and how it will impact worker rights, consumer privacy, human rights, AI discrimination, and so much more. My name is Julie Bouanna. I am the director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, which is a coalition of over 65 labor, environmental, consumer privacy, international solidarity, and other organizations committed to a fair and balanced global trading system. We have a really incredible panel here, really great speakers here to talk with you all tonight. We will be joined shortly by U.S. Congresswoman Jayapal. We have the Secretary-Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council, Cherika Carter. We have the Technology and Liberty Project Manager at the ACLU Washington, Jen Lee. We have the Secretary General of the Central Labor Confederation in the Philippines, Josua Mata. And we have the Director of the Rethink Trade Program at American Economic Liberties Project, Wallach. So clearly a really wonderful lineup and really excited to get into our program. But before we get into our panel, I do want to take some time to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and ceded land of the Coast Salish people, the first people, specifically the first people of Seattle, the Squamish people, stewards of the land past and present. And so I would encourage you to go beyond acknowledgement and go to realrunduamish.org to pay homage to the original peoples of this land. So with that really important acknowledgement aside, we're going to get into our program today. Again, we're here to talk about big tech, if you can tell by all the signs. And we're going to talk about, what their agenda is for international trade deals and what that means for, our lives, right? Our jobs, our data, where it goes, our biometric information, and so much more. This conversation comes at a really critical time. So I kind of want to frame our discussion. We, right, society, lawmakers are kind of waking up to the outsized role that these big tech companies have on, our lives, on our economy, on our society at large. It seems like every other article in the New York Times is something about artificial intelligence and some disastrous implication of it. And we know that the development of these tools, the rapid evolution of the internet, and the extension of the digital economy is really affecting our lives in every way. It's affecting every aspect of our lives. And in some really great ways, but also in some dangerous ways. We know that artificial intelligence has led to the expansion of bias predictive policing and prosecution, employment discrimination, intrusive worker surveillance, and unfair lending practices. Huge corporations like Google and Amazon are using problematic algorithms to self-reference their services and crush competitors, which increases their monopoly power. And we're at this time where lawmakers are kind of starting to catch on to that and starting to pass and propose and pass really important laws, consumer privacy laws, digital privacy laws at the local, the national, and the international level to rein in big tech's abuses and protect public interest. some of the legislation unfold here was recently passed in Washington State. And obviously, it's probably no surprise that big tech is not like that. They don't like their being reined in, they don't like regulation. Haven't yet heard of a corporation that does. So in response to this regulation, corporations are currently trying to use trade agreements. Big tech corporations are trying to use trade agreements to lock in binding international laws and rules that would essentially handcuff lawmakers from being able to regulate the companies. It would allow big tech to move our data, however, into wherever they want to see it, which would bring with it the offshoring of data-driven jobs. It would allow corporations to skirt labor regulations and hurt big economy. And it would give these companies the green light to expand the use of discriminatory AI to bail out bigger workforce, but also sustain. Those are just a few of the implications. And I know when we talk about big tech, time really kind of hypothetical, and talking about such a complex issue. So I do really want to ground this discussion in the real life impacts that big tech's agenda have on workers, for example. It can look like a good union communication job in the US being outsourced to a call center in the Philippines, where workers are facing a litany of labor excuses, from low wages to long hours to increased surveillance on the job. And talking about surveillance, it's not an issue in the Philippines, it's an issue everywhere. We've seen employers increasingly using software or artificial intelligence to essentially place workers on the job, enforcing a faster pace of work and also cutting down on breaks and cracking down on other forms of employee downtime. This is kind of creating a situation where in every sector, from the communication sector to hospitality, manufacturing, increasingly algorithms and not humans are the ones making promotion, hiring, and firing decisions. This is a great situation where hotel workers fired because they didn't know the trick that is maybe not for them, and they could be fired, and their own supervisor wouldn't even really know how to explain that to them because the algorithms are hidden behind classification trees. So obviously it's having a huge effect. It could also look like our sensitive health data being shipped overseas to where it can find less supply. It doesn't even have to go to our world. Our health data is being shipped, across state lines to have really devastating implications for, abortion care for patients. And of course, the issue of discriminatory technology. We really don't have to talk hypotheticals here. The New York Times recently ran a piece on Persia Woodruff, a Black woman who was arrested last February while she was 8 months pregnant for a carjacking that she did not commit. She was wrongfully accused of the result of facial recognition technology. So obviously, big tech's agenda is very real, very devastating. And as I've said before, this conversation cannot come at a more crucial time and a more crucial place. As we speak, trade officials from 21 different countries are in Seattle in our own backyard discussing how to expand trade in the region. This is part of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and it is happening in Seattle right now. Negotiators are here. They're here from Google, they're here from Meta, Amazon, Airbnb, Starbucks, Boeing, and obviously the public and the press are shut out. So the very process through which big tech is trying to break these trade deals is literally happening right now. So it's really important trying to be having these conversations, and I'm so honored to have this incredible lineup of speakers to get more into what it is that I have to do.
Again, thank you all for being here this evening. We will next overview, and so without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce to you all know, U.S. Congress Member Jayapal to give opening remarks, and we'll then move into Q&A for the rest. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today, and it's wonderful to see you all and have a new panel to hear from that is going to be just doing remarkable work. So we thank Julie Bouanna, Cherika Carter, Josua Mata, and Wallach. Very grateful to the Washington Fair Trade Coalition for all the work that you've done to help educate people about the difference between free trade and fair trade, and to begin to shift the momentum on this critical issue. Now, I think I see a lot of friends in the room that were part of the WTO protests, but for the people that work here in Seattle or didn't know about this, we really have played a leading role, I think, in terms of raising up a lot of these issues in 1999 when we had the WTO here, and those protests, I think, brought a lot of attention to the issues that we were talking about, and really the distinction that I mentioned between, because we get a lot of criticism sometimes on the left, people saying you're against trade. Not against trade, but the question of what is free trade and what is fair trade. Free trade being with really no restrictions, no boundaries, no red lines around our values, and the ability to continue to engage in agreements that lift up workers' rights, that lift up human rights, that lift up environmental justice, and fair trade, where we are actually promoting those very values within the trade agreements that we agree to. I think the rules that we set, we have seen with these trade agreements, are critical to power and equality, and they are often skewed to essentially protect the largest corporations instead of power of workers to organize and to prevent monopolistic power grabs by corporations. So that WTO protest was a wake-up call, I think, to the rest of the country about the reality that trade agreements can be used also to impose binding and enforceable obligations on our country and on other countries with which governments are then required to comply. Now, that can be a good thing if the obligations require that countries and companies comply with international agreements on those very issues that I talked about, labor rights, environmental protections, and human rights. But it can be a very bad thing if the obligations end up undermining those core values, as well as restricting our own government's ability to regulate for the public interest. So I think you may have talked about some of these things. I walked in just as you were beginning some of that conversation, but just take a look, for example, at the pharmaceutical industry as an example here. So Big Pharma hatched a plan to insert language into trade pacts that guarantees linked patent extensions and other monopoly protections so that they can charge exorbitant prices for medicine and maximize their profit at the cost of our health, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And we've seen Wall Street insert language into trade pacts to make it harder to regulate toxic derivatives and safeguard this idea of too big to fail. Agribusiness corporations inserted terms into trade agreements to impose restrictions on food safety, inspection, and consumer labeling programs. And when corporations are worried that they're going to be regulated in one place, they often turn to these trade deals as a way of imposing binding obligations on governments at home and around the world that then limit those policies from being enacted in the first place. And this is exactly what we see big tech attempting to do today. I was the vice chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee in the 116th Congress when we launched our legislative platform responding to our 16-month investigation of 4 big tech companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. We showed how these companies use their monopolistic power to drive up prices and to reduce choices for consumers and for workers. And I want to say we all use
the technology from these 4 companies. When I say this, it doesn't mean that everything the companies are doing is bad. However, it does mean that we still have to rein in behavior that hurts consumers, hurts workers, and stifles competition. We were able to draw tremendous attention to the problems of monopoly power and big tech, and to build some momentum by passing a bipartisan suite of bills in the House Judiciary Committee, including my bill, the Ending Platform Monopolies Act, to break up corporations that are too big to care and too powerful to put people over profits. At this precise moment, when policymakers and the public are finally paying increased attention to the enormous role that big tech plays in our economy and in our society, different big tech interests want to internationally preempt the United States Congress's ability and other governments' ability to enact all sorts of measures addressing consumer privacy, data security, AI accountability, online discrimination, abuse of gig workers, and big tech monopolies killing smaller firms and abusing customers. Very proud, by the way, to have the bill to ban the government's use of facial recognition technology because of many of these issues that we're dealing with. The aim of these tech giants is to derail government oversight and policies that protect workers, consumers, and small businesses. Trade agreements then become a vehicle to quietly slip in what we're now calling so-called digital trade rules that help preserve that anti-competitive power. Dangerous provisions were already slipped into trade agreements during the Trump administration, but now there are interests that seek to lock in and expand those rules and apply them to a lot more countries via trade talks that are currently underway. For over a year, I've been working in partnership with Senator Elizabeth Warren and with other members of the House and the Senate to call out the revolving door between big tech and the Department of Commerce, and the impact that this revolving door can have on global digital trade rules. So let me describe some of what the industry is proposing with those rules now, and what we, I think, need to do and organize around to ensure that we're preserving the policy space needed to put together appropriate regulations for big tech. And the 3 major areas I want to focus on are, first, AI accountability and online civil rights and civil liberties. Second, consumer privacy. And third, anti-monopoly. So on the first one, we need to ensure that these trade agreements include no provisions that limit potential AI regulation. Again, just what was being spoken about, and that includes no special secrecy guarantees for AI companies' algorithms and source codes. Now, you've probably heard about artificial intelligence in the news recently. Maybe you've used ChatGPT, but there is already a pervasive use of AI in other forms called automated decision-making. There are systems that are using algorithms and very large data sets to automate decisions around criminal prosecution, around sentencing and bail, around loans and housing, around healthcare services, job applications, wages, promotions, and more. I want to be clear that this is not anti-AI. AI can be incredibly helpful in a wide range of areas, including scientific and medical research, environmental protection, and elsewhere. But recent experience has shown us that many of the algorithms that are used in AI and the huge data sets that they rely on actually replicate the very same forms of discrimination that we have been fighting against throughout society. Also, there's a question of what consumers know about when these algorithms are being used, because increasingly consumers don't even know that the decisions that are being made that affect their health or their housing or any of these other services are done by an algorithm. And those algorithms have enormous assumptions built in that actually end up undermining the quality of care as well as equal protection under the law. We've seen this happening. You heard one example of this. I want to point out another one that's being used. Another topic near and dear to my heart is around the privatization of Medicare that's happening and Medicare Advantage. private insurance companies that run Medicare Advantage using AI to kick seniors off of care that they rightly deserve because the algorithm has decided they can only stay in that care for 10 days or 12 days or whatever the average number is. But also in hiring practices, as I said, criminal justice applications, search engines, face recognition, provision of public services, self-driving cars, you name it, AI is probably there. So we can't hide our heads in the sand and pretend that this transformation doesn't exist. We need to wrap our arms around how to regulate properly, including around potential abuses that we may not even be able to predict sitting here in 2023. At the same time, recognizing the real potential for good, for innovative research that can solve health problems or be used for global mapping or environmental protection and much more. We also have to fight back against big tech interests that seek strict secrecy guarantees in our trade agreements that would impede governments from using the very tools that the AI experts worldwide recommend. Tools that are also promoted, by the way, in the White House's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Things like pre-screening of AI and detailed documentation, which requires access to the detailed descriptions of algorithms and sometimes of the source code itself. This administration, the Biden administration's AI Bill of Rights and numerous pending bills in Congress propose to counter AI abuses related to illegal police surveillance or denial of employment or credit or housing or violations of antitrust and other fair market policies, wage and hour violations, invasions of worker privacy and rights to organize unions, and online self-preferencing and other monopoly abuses. Much of this in the White House Bill of Rights, AI Bill of Rights, if not all of it, would be forbidden under the digital trade rules that industry wants. So big tech's demands to insert AI secrecy guarantees in our trade deals would endanger government regulation as well as the public's understanding of how their data is actually being utilized, how your data is being utilized. And there's really no justification for the secrecy because trade rules already require that governments keep firms' confidential business information secret, the information that's submitted to a government for a regulatory process. The special additional secrecy rules that big tech is demanding would just make it hard to regulate AI moving forward. We also need to monitor carefully another potentially dangerous element of the big tech digital trade agenda regarding data flows and the location of computing facilities. And I know this sounds very wonky, and some of this is as part of the challenge of getting the information out. But we need to rebalance these rules to protect our policy space around your privacy protection and data security. Obviously, a functioning internet requires the ability to transfer data, often across borders, but there are real concerns about authoritarian governments censoring platforms and pieces of information that they find inconvenient to their rule. But let's not kid ourselves. There are differences between public information that you find in a newspaper or a library and should easily be able to look up on the internet and personal information that you find in your private medical and banking records. Certain digital trade proposals would give companies absolute control over all that data, including the most sensitive personal information and also the most sensitive government and business information, like relating to the operation of water and electrical systems or nuclear power plants. So forbidding governments from regulating the flow of data or where it's stored would greatly undermine policies that are needed to protect consumer privacy and to ensure that data is kept, sensitive data is kept securely. Not all agreements on data flows and storage are necessarily bad, but there are plenty of legitimate reasons why we shouldn't give big tech carte blanche over where our personal information is shipped, processed, and stored. I believe, and this has been a hallmark of my time in Congress, that people deserve real control over where their personal information is shared. They should have the right to minimization of what your personal data, what pieces of your personal data is kept, or to be able to delete certain data, or to be able to get corrections to that data. And we can't be in a position where we allow trade agreements to undermine that work that we are still trying to do here in the United States, much less around the world. The third concern, and the last one I'll mention now, is our ability to promote fair competition and to safeguard against monopolies. Groups speaking out against big tech's digital trade proposals include labor unions, civil rights organizations, consumer advocates, faith communities, and other representatives of civil society. But small and medium-sized tech players are also speaking out because the biggest of the big tech giants are trying to hijack trade agreements in ways that not just undermine consumer privacy and AI accountability like we've spoken about, but also undermine antitrust and fair competition measures. The ways that trade agreements can do this is a little bit complicated, but essentially it revolves around using trade deals to label any laws and regulations that have a disproportionate impact on certain platforms or products or services over others as an illegal, discriminatory trade barrier that has to be eliminated, even if that disproportionate impact is just based on a company's market share or size. If some of these interests in big tech were to get their way, basically any policy that targets monopolies could become an illegal trade barrier. So we need to ensure that our trade rules enable fair competition and don't limit our ability to go after monopolies. I know our panelists are going to dive deeply into these and other areas, and so I'll just close by saying there is a way to fix things and to get this right. The president has said that he's committed to creating a new worker-centered trade policy. He has led a great all-of-government competition policy initiative, and in his 2023 State of the Union address, he called out big tech by name and declared that his administration would fight to ensure privacy and protect our kids from big tech abuses. And we have incredible champions in the administration like Nina Khan and Rohit Chopra, really doing the work of the agency to address some of these issues. The president's US Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai, has called for a new way of doing things on digital trade to replace the old corporate rig rules in Trump's USMCA. She wants rules that are supported by labor, by privacy advocates, by small business, and by others. But we need to help make that vision a reality. And one way we can get there, and the reason I'm here today, is because it really takes folks like you shining a light on this issue and helping to break it down for people so that more people understand how these trade agreements are being used. Because the hundreds of official industry trade advisors and big tech lobbyists in DC, and Elizabeth Warren and I are working on a letter right now about some of these advisory committees that are set up that are stacked, really stacked with industry lobbyists instead of with regular folks that represent your interests and our constituents' interests. So the deck is rigged, it is stacked, it's on full tilt to allow some of these big corporate interests to commandeer these current trade talks with Asia, including in the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership or IPEC, as well as global talks, and to get these kind of big tech powers and rights locked in. I mentioned earlier my work challenging the revolving door between big tech firms and certain US agencies in charge of pending trade negotiations. The more that groups like the Washington Fair Trade Coalition and others shine a spotlight on what big tech is up to in these pending trade negotiations, the harder a time they're going to have rigging the rules behind closed doors. But right now, it is a very secretive process for consumer advocates, for labor advocates, not for the big tech and corporate interests. So digital trade in air quotes, is the one big tech and other corporate interests are pushing on the hardest right now, because it is harder to understand. I think the information is not as clearly out there, and whatever's decided in pending negotiations really could impact people right here in Seattle and around the world for decades to come. So I want to thank you all for being in the room. I want to thank the panel for their incredible work and the coalition for really shining a spotlight on this and keeping everyone's feet to the fire and helping to broaden the education of people around our country, here in the state and around our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this one. That was such a great framing of what we're talking about here. It's so great to have such an amazing champion in the house along with other groups fighting for public interest. So I just want to give about 5 minutes for some questions for the congresswoman. If anyone has any questions about this topic before we go into the rest of the panel.
Clear as mud, huh?
We have about 100 folks on Zoom. We have a question here asking what type of legislation is being worked on at the national level that could be impacted by big tech's digital agenda?
Really, all of it. I mean, any of the regulation that we try to put in place, and look, Congress is not quick to act on these things. I mean, we are still trying to move our bipartisan legislation that passed 2 Congresses ago on antitrust as an example. And now, you know, we're trying to focus on AI. It's unclear whether we're going to be able to get legislation passed in this Congress. But what I would say is we don't want the trade agreements to take away our ability to regulate. And that is what happens with a lot of these trade agreements. I think people haven't even fully comprehended until the trade agreement is in place, that it actually takes away the ability for local, state, and federal governments to pass our own legislation to regulate in our own boundaries and territories. And that is one of the fears I have, is that we are developing these trade agreements right now. And even if Congress were to regulate, it could either undermine legislation that we put forward in the future, or it could lead to a situation where once these technologies are out, and we're facing this with face recognition technology too, it's difficult to pull them back in. I mean, that is one of the hardest things about these technologies. They're not manufacturing plants that you go and build, which take much longer and have a process. They are technologies that can move very quickly, data that's stored in other places that can move very quickly. And so I do have real concern about a trade agreement or any set of trade agreements essentially locking in a set of behaviors that are ultimately not beneficial to the people of our own country or people globally around the world that we're in solidarity with.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean that's a great answer, and yeah, that's definitely, you know, kind of why this conversation is so crucial, is because, you know, we have this really important time to make sure that these types of rules aren't implemented before we get a chance to really take a look at what we need to do to regulate tech abuses. So thanks so much for that.
I have a question, because you mentioned that the administration is working on a blueprint around AI regulation.
Yeah.
Aren't they involved in those trade agreements as well? Aren't they part of the discussion? Because for me, it's really, who is discussing in those trade agreements?
Yeah, no, it is complicated. So the White House has an initiative, and they just unrolled, you know, sort of a blueprint. It is voluntary, so you know it's a set of principles, but it's at this point it's voluntary for companies to follow those. Some are more detailed than others, but in these trade agreements, you have the USTR, Catherine Tai, who I think is really trying to do trade agreements in a different way. But you also have the State Department, you also have other entities that are involved in those negotiations, and each one of the agencies has advisory committees also. The USTR's advisory committee, actually, thanks to the advocacy of Lori and many of our folks, has now contains representation that is very different from the previous committee, where we actually have labor represented, we actually have consumers represented, but not, there are other committees, and that's the letter that Elizabeth and I are sending, that do not have that representation. So, and those are the advisory committees that, by the way, get access to all kinds of information. If I want to look, as a member of Congress, if I want to look at the language that's been negotiated, I have to go to the SCIP, The SCIP is the confidential place in the Capitol. It's a physical trip for me. My legislative director, Jennifer Chan, is here. She is not allowed into the SCIP because she doesn't have the security clearance to go into the SCIP. So our staff can't read these agreements, but a lot of the corporate lobbyists who are on these committees are getting that information. So it is the information is it is not easy to access, and we also are not privy to all the conversations, obviously, and we understand that. I mean, negotiations happen behind closed doors all the time. But I think, making sure that the revolving door of people that are advising these agreements are not just those interests is really important. So it's a lot of different players that are a part of it.
Hi, thank you for being here. How are we going to get a public interest that if it's on these committees?
Well, you've got some experts here that helped to do it on one of the committees. You'll see our letter that Senator Warren and I are sending that is specifically on these issues. But look, I think it's the same way we've organized every step of the way against a lot of these big corporate interests. We need an organizing movement. We need smart policy advocacy. We need to explain it in ways that is understandable. I will tell you that on privacy and data in particular, we have an interesting left-right coalition in Congress, the Progressive Caucus, which I chair, 103 members strong, and the some parts of the Freedom Caucus care about data. Now, the way that they frame it can be very different in this polarized environment. A lot of it is around, the too woke environment and some things that we wouldn't necessarily, but at the core is this idea of civil liberties protection and data privacy and data privacy protections. And so there is, I think, a good marriage there. I just think it's difficult, but we have to break down every layer. And I think these folks are doing some of that really important work to do that and to really make the links also between domestic and international. Like, I feel like a lot of times and on trade agreements, Democrats were not in the right place on trade agreements for a very, very long time. And I think we're still experiencing the consequences of that. These are international trade agreements, but they affect workers right here in the United States. And I would argue that we lost a lot of workers who saw us as a Democratic Party not standing up against these free trade agreements that hurt jobs right here in the United States. And by the way, contributed to all kinds of other things like migration. I mean, as an immigration person, if you look at the connection between migration and the last set of trade agreements that we passed, you see a really high correlation between what we do when we essentially enter into these free trade agreements with no labor protections, no workers' rights, and how it actually hurts those countries as well as our country.
Thank you so much. We're gonna end it there with Congresswoman Jayapal again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you also much. And if you do have more questions, we have some incredible experts coming up next. So we will have a Q&A at the end of our panel as well. So again, thank you so much to Congresswoman Jayapal. It's really great to have such a champion because, as she mentioned, a lot of folks at the table aren't necessarily very interested in public interest. So I'm really excited to introduce the rest of our panel. I'll kind of introduce as we go along. First up, we have Cherika Carter, who was elected Secretary Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council in 2022. She's a certified pharmacy technician by trade and has carried a union card for over half of her life. As a graduate of the Ohio State University, she is a forever Buckeye that every state is full. When she's thinking about growing political power or fighting for Washington's working families, she's on a testament for mixed Sunday brunch spot with friends. And so much to be.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you so much to Representative Jayapal for your remarks. I'm really excited to be with you all today to discuss the impacts of digital trade. And thank you to the Washington Fair Trade Coalition for the opportunity to join the other panelists, Julie, Joshua, Lori, and Jen to have this conversation today to discuss the impacts of digital trade, specifically on America's working families. And so, like Julie mentioned, my name is Cherika Carter. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm probably the Secretary Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council, ACLU, which represents over 500,000 workers across Washington State under the leadership of our President, April Sims, who was the first woman to be elected as president of the WSOP and the first Black woman elected of any AFL-CIO state federated body as president. Together, we make up the first state federation in the AFL-CIO's history to be represented by 2 Black people. And so this is an exciting time. I could say it is because of being able to testament of our leadership, but it's really about the commitment of Washington's labor movement, their commitment to equity, and our work to be actively an anti-racist organization and movement where we're creating one where all workers want to join in. And so proud of the work that we are doing. And so in terms of my remarks, I just want to start again by saying thank you. I'm excited for this conversation with y'all. And so as President Biden's administration continues to remake U.S. trade policy, its worker-centered approach extends to digital trade and the digital economy. The idea to place the needs of workers, consumers, and society ahead of the profits and interests of big technology companies. At the Washington State Labor Council, we are well aware of how digital trade policy impacts and can impact workers in our state and across the world. And so far, U.S. digital trade policy has prioritized securing increased market access and intellectual property rights for its big technology firms. And it has included broad prohibitions against any government measures that could restrict corporations' ability to move, process, and store data as they see fit. And recent digital trade texts make no reference to workers' rights. They do not require governments to take any meaningful action to protect individuals' personal data. And so this is alarming for our membership and for Washington's working families. Technology companies and other employers are increasingly supervising, surveilling, and even disciplining workers with automated artificial intelligence and algorithmic management. These systems, as was mentioned earlier by Julie, they can shortchange workers' earnings, expose workers to unsafe workplace conditions, and infringe on the right to form unions. Platform companies such as ride-hailing and delivery services
exclusive model of employment for so-called gig workers and low earnings, uncertain work schedules, individual transformation has enabled the corporate offshoring of coding categories of jobs. So we're talking about workers in call centers, information technology, back office, and even healthcare through telemedicine. They also continue to facilitate the privatization of public data and data services, costing jobs and undermining the quality of publicly delivered services. So many of these jobs are being shipped to countries where workers are paid hourly wages that they consider reflections for organizing trade. And it shouldn't be this way. As U.S. Trade Representative Captain Powell said herself, in 2021, digital trade must be grounded in how it affects our people and our workers and provide safe, to prioritize flexible policies.
Rapidly evolving forms of digital commerce. but how do we achieve this vision? And so I offer two proposals. First, we need to preserve government's right to regulate the digital economy. And second, when we think about a worker-centered digital trade policy, it should also include positive commitments by governments to address the many challenges connected to digital transformation. And so in terms of how we preserve government's rights to regulate the digital economy, the rapid digital transformation of the economy has emerged largely without the knowledge, consent, or input of the people most affected, the workers and consumers. And we are the ones whose lives are increasingly governed, surveilling by technological revolution. And so we should have the right to create public policy that addresses our concerns. And we know that recent U.S. digital trade agreements have granted broad corporate rights while imposing rigid restriction on the measures governments can adopt to promote legitimate public policy interests. And so the sweeping nature of these commitments is alarming, given that most countries, including the United States, lack a comprehensive federal regulatory framework to address the downsides of digitalization on workers in society. And applying these restrictions to the fast evolving digital economy risks locking in an unregulated status quo that only benefits large technology companies and could undermine efforts to safeguard worker and consumer data privacy. The rapidly evolving digital economy warrants new approaches to address the negative impacts on workers, consumers, and society. And we know that a worker-centered digital trade agenda must enshrine the right to regulate these new technologies to protect workers and consumers by enforcing current law and addressing emerging impacts on the workplace and society. And in terms of how we make sure we are centering workers in this trade policy, we have to ensure that the digital trade agreements are subject to strong and enforceable labor standards. It is essential that countries establish strong guardrails to avoid a race to the bottom and regulation of corporate conduct. In addition, we have to discourage low-road digital offshoring by safeguarding critical, vulnerable, and personal data that not only protects the security of people and the economy, but it also helps keep good jobs here in the US. Big tech companies and other employers have demonstrated unfettered cross-border data flows in part to facilitate the offshoring of jobs, often where these countries have weak data protection regimes and widespread labor rights abuses. And so we know, it is exploiting workers. In addition, we have to facilitate meaningful oversight of source codes and algorithms to ensure compliance with labor and employment laws, where employers are increasingly using automated systems to hire, manage, control, monitor, discipline, and even fire workers, largely without the knowledge, consent, or input of workers or unions. These new employer tools can undermine workers' rights, compromise workplace safety, violate wage and hour laws, and discriminate against protected classes of workers in hiring, promotion, or termination. Women, people of color, and immigrant workers are particularly at risk as they are more likely to be employed in lower wage workplaces where these technologies are widely deployed and the bias that's coded within the technology. And so worker-centered digital trade agenda must ensure that companies are held accountable for the risks associated with automated systems that implement critical decision-making protocol. And so in addition, we have to make sure that we are addressing the threats to workers' privacy, including employer use of workplace surveillance software, which has skyrocketed with the rise of telework during the pandemic. And we have to make sure we are addressing abusive employment practices in the technology sector, where large technology and platform companies continue to promote an employment model based on rampant employment misclassification and the outsourcing of poor job functions. And so to sum things up in closing, I would say that too often the debate over digital trade is unhelpfully framed as a binary choice between authoritarian digital censorship or the unregulated status quo, where big international technology companies are largely free to do as they see fit. The labor movement rejects this false choice. No rigged trade deals for big tech. Instead, we call for a new democratic stakeholder-driven approach to data governance that addresses the negative impacts of digitalization on workers, consumers, and society. And we know that the Biden administration's worker-centered trading policy is a major opportunity to protect personal data, strengthen economic security, protect domestic jobs, and tackle the downside of the digital transition. And we look forward to continuing opportunities to engage elected to center workers in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Yeah, it's super important to hear from a labor perspective because some of these policies, I mean, all of these policies will really, impact workers both here and abroad. So that's super important. So our next speaker, we're going to go to Jen Lee, who is the Technology Policy Program Director at the ACLU Washington. She advocates for state and local legislation to regulate powerful surveillance and AI technologies. So take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. As Julie shared, I lead the technology and liberty policy work at the ACLU Washington. For those of you who are not familiar with ACLU, we are a nonprofit organization and the biggest public-based law firm in the U.S. We work with courts and legislatures and communities to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed by our Constitution and our laws. So we work on lots of different issue areas, and they're intersecting. And they span healthcare, immigration, tech, gender justice, and reproductive care. But I'm focusing on the tech and liberty today. So a focus of my work over the past almost 5 years I've been at the ACLU Washington has been to pass strong privacy laws that protects people's rights and laws regulating algorithms or automated decision systems, as mentioned by Representative Jayapal. We're working on lots of other surveillance technology regulations and other sorts of policies, but I'm going to focus on those two things so you can expand a lot of what is going to be impacted if I can those. So as shared by both Julie and Representative Jayapal, both government agencies and companies are increasingly using powerful automated decision systems to make some of the biggest decisions about our lives, from whether people receive healthcare to whether they can receive housing assistance to how they're sentenced to prison. And unfortunately, these tools are often non-transparent and unaccountable to the people who are affected by the decisions made by these tools. Often the agencies and the companies that develop these secret algorithms or if there are agencies out there procuring these secret algorithms, may not even know exactly how these tools make decisions. So when an algorithm decides to deny someone disability benefits, cuts them off from medications, or holds them in jail without bail, that person may never know why, and that agency or the company creating that algorithm or deploying that algorithm may never know either. This lack of transparency and accountability has created due process nightmares in states like Arkansas and Idaho, where people with disabilities have lost benefits that allow them to lead meaningful lives on their own. And in Michigan, use of unaccountable automated decision-making technology led to over 400,000 residents having their unemployment checks wrongfully withheld due to false fraud determinations. This algorithmic error ended up ruining the lives of many families, some of whom were fined thousands of dollars and had to declare bankruptcy. I want to share, just in case folks are not as familiar with automated decision systems, how these systems work. And to put it simply, they are complex mathematical formulas. I should say many, though not all of these automated decision systems are created using complex mathematical formulas based on statistical regression analysis or machine learning, which is a type of artificial intelligence. And to put it simply, these formulas are created by using computers to look for commonalities in large data sets. So, for instance, an HR software company might create hiring formulas based on computation of what successful or unsuccessful job candidates have in common given all of their data from the job application process. Once the computer determines a formula or algorithm based on all the data available, that algorithm may then be applied to future job applicants to score their fitness for a role. But because these algorithms identify people who are similar to those who have previously been hired, these systems may simply reinforce and exacerbate any bias that already exists and was that exists in past hiring decisions. And the key here is that there's no visibility or opportunity for correction. And it's important to note that not all biases may be obvious because sometimes characteristics that aren't directly associated with things like age, gender, or race can still indirectly reflect those characteristics. So, for instance, an algorithm may discriminate against candidates who live in certain zip codes, which could indirectly affect BIPOC candidates or candidates with lower incomes. And when an algorithm is used for job applications, the hiring manager may be unduly influenced by suggestions made by the algorithm and may never know exactly why certain applicants are being recommended or rejected and whether those reasons have anything to do with their ability to do the job. There's also something called automation bias, where people unduly defer to algorithmic outputs as unbiased or accurate, even when those outputs may be even more biased or inaccurate than human decisions. So this, of course, raises concerns when we're thinking about multi-algorithms or discriminatory algorithms. I want to share a few areas where we are really concerned about the use of automated decision systems. And one of those areas is in the criminal justice system, and the other is policing. So we're really concerned about automated decision systems because they often rely on data reflecting historical discrimination. And that means decisions also discriminate. So you can see that because we're seeing that AI is increasingly being employed in the criminal justice system, that has really dangerous and cyber-death consequences. So predictive policing systems determine where law enforcement should deploy resources, but these systems use data to reflect the historical over-policing of neighborhoods of color. As was previously mentioned, facial recognition tools have led to many wrongful arrests. Faulty risk assessment systems have recommended different sentences for the same crime-based celebrities. And again, in the employment market, as I mentioned, algorithms that screen applicants can often replicate and reinforce lack of diversity in different sectors. In Washington State, the ACLU has worked to pass bans on facial recognition technology. So in July of 2021, we passed facial recognition ban in King County, Washington, which is the biggest county in Washington State, and home for states on Microsoft. Shortly after, we also supported a ban on predictive policing tools and ban on facial recognition technology in Bellingham, Washington. That was put, and that ban was put forward by an initiative from the first Bellingham. But more broadly, beyond these specific bans, we've been working to pass an algorithmic accountability law in Washington State that would not only regulate predictive policing tools and facial recognition tools, but would also regulate things like risk assessment systems, things like benefits distribution algorithms, and other types of systems that may not necessarily at first glance seem to be problematic, but could operate inaccurately or contain biases. So in 2021, we introduced an automated decision system bill, and that bill number at the time was SB 5116, sponsored by Senator Nakagawa. And that bill would require any government agency using an automated decision-making system to make transparent their use of such tools. And this bill would also prohibit government agencies from using machines to discriminate. If a person can't discriminate, then they should be able to use a machine to do so either. And so would also hold government agencies accountable. We thought that this bill was just so necessary because one of the issues about trying to hold these systems accountable is that we often don't even know where they exist. One of the projects that led in 2019 to 2021 was a public records request project that looked to try to see we were trying to see what agencies are even using automated decision systems and what automated decision systems used to look like in Washington State. And we ran into issues with that because agencies often don't even know whether they're using automated decision systems. So the responses we received were really reflective of that, and really underscored the need for a bill, an enforceable bill that would require agencies to figure out what if their systems are algorithmically driven, if their systems are operating accurately, if they've ever been audited for biases or inaccuracies, and again, if they're discriminating, so that people can know if these systems exist, if decisions are being made by them, and if so, what opportunity there is for correction. Unfortunately, in 2021, that bill did not move, but we did manage to pass a budget proviso that created a task force and a working group to create a report on with best practices and doing a case study or pilot on an existing use of an ADS. So we looked at the Department of Corrections Risk Supervision Management System. We found that's to have lots of problems, to be incredibly biased, but we did manage to move out a report by consensus with pretty strong recommendations. In 2022, unfortunately, we still weren't able to push the bill past the fiscal committee, though we did move it out of the policy committee. And I think it's mostly due to political tensions and difficulties rather than there being substantive disagreements about whether this policy is something that's supported. And this past session in 2023, we continued to push forward this bill in a different committee. It was moved to a different committee, policy committee this year. But we're continuing to do the work and educate folks on why this kind of bill is so important, and looking to, remove some baseline automated decision system regulations out of Washington State, so we can really be a model for other states as well. I want to mention this is really the first of its kind bill across the country. Now speaking about IPEP, as Representative Jayapal mentioned, one of the biggest issues with IPEP is that it would totally, hamper, obstruct all our efforts at the state level, also at the local level and at the federal level to pass these kinds of regulations. It's working so hard to pass. One of the foundational pieces of the ADS bill that we're trying to pass is transparency, requiring that companies that are developing these algorithms, if government agencies are procuring them, to make their source code available so that we can actually inspect their algorithms for biases or inaccuracies, or at the very least, if the source code is not directly applicable, at least being able to have some sort of independent testing and third-party auditing or some sort of method to make sure that these systems are not harming people or are operating in an accurate fashion. So we are really concerned about IPEP because, they would just totally negate all the work we're doing and hinder our ability to move this kind of legislation forward in the future as well. This piece is really important, but I also want to bring in the other piece, which is data privacy. And I'll keep my remarks pretty short on this. We've been working past comprehensive privacy legislation in Washington State for many years now. We've seen big tech companies lobby to pass really weak privacy legislation. I think big tech's work at the international level with IPEP and other trade deals, and at the local level, they're complementary. They're simultaneously looking to push forward really weak legislation that preserves the status quo while preserving or creating a facade of protections, while at the international level or the federal level, trying to push forward agreements or regulations that really hamper the ability to pass truly strong regulations. So there's some double speed happening that we witness where companies are saying they want transparency, but the regulations that they're lobbying for really hamper all transparency. So as mentioned earlier, IPEP also allows for unfettered control of data by industry with powers to move processing of personal data that would undermine privacy law that we're trying to push, like the People's Privacy Act. This past session we passed My Health My Data, which is the consumer health privacy law, but these sort of IPAC and digital trade agreements that hamper our ability to pass privacy regulations would have an impact with these types of more sector-specific laws as well. So we're really concerned about IPAC. I think anyone who's working to regulate AI or privacy in the space really needs to be concerned about trade regulations. I'm so grateful to the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, People of Trade, for bringing me along in learning about these trade regulations and how they impact the type of work we're doing in the tech space, because I have no idea. And again, that's one of the problems with these trade agreements, move them quickly without much transparency, and how they move this, people don't know about it, and things like that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for being such a strong advocate in our state for privacy. Yeah, I think that's big tech. It's not the easiest thing to do, but so our next speaker is excited to introduce Josua Mata, who is currently serving as the Secretary General of the 80,000 strong Central Labor Confederation in the Philippines. He's been a trade unionist for more than 30 years and has been invited as a resource person and trainer on neoliberal globalization, anti-WTO campaigns, social movement unionism, and comprehensive trade union issues in at least 20 countries. So take it away, Jayapal.
Thank you. Just to mention that my baptism of fire on campaigns against WTO and free trade agreement actually happened here in Seattle during the Battle of Seattle. And she's one of my mentors. So if there's anything I say that's wrong, blame her. I'm just kidding. So, no, but seriously, this whole issue of free trade agreement are things that that many in my country are still trying to grapple with. And I'm talking about the traditional free trade agreement. I'm not even talking about the new types of agreements that the government, that the Biden administration is trying to introduce. I'm not even talking about the new technologies that are involved in all these big tech discussions that we're having. And the problem is, the biggest problem for us remains the same. I've been, sorry, I'm getting off my notes for a while, but I was reflecting while I was listening to everyone. And I just find it uncanny that many of the things that we have been fighting for many years ago are still exactly the same issues that we are raising. I mean, how is it possible that governments would actually negotiate alliance without even consulting us? And how is it possible that after all these decades, when they have signed up to, my government at least has signed up to a series of FTAs that have promised one thing, but it delivered exactly the same thing, the opposite thing, and yet they seem not to listen and not to learn from their mistakes. And now, here comes digital trade. And come on, I'm from the Philippines, and many of our people in the country don't exactly understand what's going on beyond what's happening in the screen of their phones. We're one of the biggest users of Facebook, or one of the biggest text messengers in the world. But I don't think many people understand how much all these things, the technology that goes behind it, actually impacts everything that they do, from what they buy, how they should think, or how they should vote. I don't think there's enough discussion in the Philippines about these things. So having said that, now the promise of a worker-centered trade policy that you mentioned, it is really very interesting for us. It's like a fresh of breath here after being inundated with free trade agreements that has already flawed again and again, that has failed us again and again. But frankly, and with due respect, to the Biden administration, other than a lot of good sounding rhetoric about being concerned about workers, there still leaves much to be desired about this whole discussion in the whole idea of a worker-centered trade policy. In the first place, in the Philippines, well, we were so excited when the USTR representative herself talked to us in Manila. When we told her that, no, this is example, we're going to get into IPEF, which is an example of a worker-centered trade policy. But then we asked them, why is it our government hasn't discussed anything with us at all? They've had how many rounds now on IPEF? 4. They've had 4 rounds now in IPEF. And in all these rounds, they have never consulted us. They've never talked to us. And so where is the worker-centered, where is the worker in this worker-centered policy, at least as far as our end of the negotiation is going. So that's and that's to us is a very, very big worrisome concern, because to be honest, we completely doubt the ability of our government to actually understand digital trade regulations. Data storage, data privacy, the regulation of algorithms and how would it impact on our jobs, our rights, our taxes, and even our democracy. Now, these are things that I have barely heard my government talk about. So how are they going to be engaged now? How are they going to represent us in a negotiation around digital trade when we're not even sure if they completely understand what's going on? So that's very worrisome for us. We know for a fact that my government is still groping on the very issues of how do we deal with platform workers. Do you know that we have been debating in the Senate, in the Philippines, we have been debating about a bill that aims to protect finally freelance workers. And then we can't agree on what do you mean by freelance. So we can't even agree to that. So it has become so cumbersome that the bill that is now looking so cumbersome because it's trying to embrace all sorts of people who are supposed to be working on the platforms. From the traditional BPO workers, what we call center agents or business processing outsourced workers, to completely freelance online workers. Those that provide data. What do you call that? The data that you use in order to help the machines learn. What do you call that?
Training.
Oh yes, those from those people all the way, for example, to gig riders. The ones who have to depend on platforms, a digital platform, in order to do the work by delivering food. And my own colleague John J. right there, he's actually an organizer of delivery platform workers. The point I'm saying is that my government can't even understand how do we protect all these people. And now we're going to get into a trade agreement that is much more complex. So what is it that they're going to say about these things? Now, so that's really a concern. Let me give you an example of how does this lack of understanding, how did it lead to a situation where a huge number of people in the Philippines are now left completely unprotected. You see, the Philippines is now known to be one of the biggest source of providers of platform work in the world. Together with South Asian countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Apparently, obviously, because of the capacity for English, to use English language. But the fact of the matter is, many people don't know that while the freelance, the effort to attract more freelance worker is trying to portray the work as something that's well, first of all, very flexible, something that you don't have to work for a boss, and you can earn money. Now, while that is the kind of rhetoric that you receive in order to attract people into that kind of work, the fact remains that most people don't understand that many of our platform workers are actually victims of labor arbitration. So platform companies, for example, who want to have some particular job done, they can have this bidded out globally. And so people from the third world who are into these jobs would have to outbid each other. And in many of these workers, they're actually doing what I would call self-exploitation, because in order to ratchet up their performance rating so that they can get more contracts later on, they tend to underbid their own value, in order to get more jobs. And so they turned out to be much more, they turn out to be overworked, but then they are completely underpaid. Now, hoping that in the future it will increase their pay. No? And therefore some of them even end up doing the job, but they're not being paid at all. But because they are online, who do they run to? There's no way for them to run after this bogus employers that ask them to do a particular job. So apart from that, the most common denominator for all of them is that there is a complete absence of non-wage benefits, as you can imagine. So there is no healthcare, there is no insurance, there's no provision, anything at all about for their retirement. Among gig riders like John Jay over there, they have to deal with the fact that they have to endure the fact that the delivery rates are unfairly and in most cases arbitrarily set by the platform companies. Like we don't have Uber in the Philippines because it was bought off by a Malaysian-based company called Grab. And he's a Grab delivery rider. And Grab is one of the better employers in that sense, but they don't have because they know what the delivery rates are. But everything else can be changed, including the rates, arbitrarily without any consultation for them. But other workers, like for example, a German subsidiary Food Panda in the Philippines, are one of the worst because the workers don't even know how their rates are being fixed, and then it alters. I mean, they keep on decreasing it, even if, for example, cost of fuel in the Philippines continue to rise. And then they have this complete lack of due process. Like if you're working one day and then a customer starts complaining, the next day you can't even log on to your platform, and therefore you can't get any job because you're offboarded without you knowing why. If you try to complain, you have to deal with a robot. You have to deal with the machine. And there's no even HR to talk to. So these are very, very problematic things for many of them. And because they are considered independent contractors, it leads to a lot of absurd things. For example, again, gig for lack of a better example, but gig riders, for example, they are called as independent contractors. Some local governments in the Philippines, like for example, Davao City, where the previous president came from, said that, okay, so you're a contractor, and therefore, like any other business contractors, you have to pay business permit. And they end up paying business permit. And in last year, when we first heard about this, we started suspecting, we're now suspecting that actually the workers themselves are the ones paying for the business permit of the platform in order to operate in that city. It gets worse. In Cebu City, another major city in the middle of the country, if I still have more time. So in that city, in that particular city, what they do is that they ask, all the local government units are saying, okay, now these people are earning so much money, so why don't we tax them in a way by asking them to pay for delivery permits? So Cebu City is a mega city. There are at least three contiguous cities that Cebu, Mactan, and sorry, my Cebuano colleagues would be angry with me for forgetting that the third one. But anyway, but can you imagine each city is asking a rider to pay for an annual delivery permit so that they can deliver whatever it is that they want to deliver in that particular city. So any rider can be accosted by the police, and if you cannot show a permit, then you're in trouble. So these are some of the absurd things that are created precisely because my country doesn't even understand how do you regulate work, in this kind of an economy. So we try to organize it. But to be honest, the attempts to organize these workers are still at the margins. Like for example, the BPO workers, the call center agents, they're trying to organize themselves into a union, but they're not yet succeeding in having their own collective bargaining agreements. John Jay and his fellow gig riders are self-organizing themselves, and they're doing strikes and they're protesting. But then it's so difficult for them to fight because they don't even know how many gig riders are involved in delivering for a particular company. There's no knowledge about it. So it's very difficult. And once they leave, like for example, again, like their friends in their colleagues in the gig riders in the Philippines, when you once you start a union, you can easily be off-boarded. Off-boarding is that you can log on to the platform and therefore you don't have a livelihood. Or you can log on, but then you realize that you don't get any orders. That's shadow banning, and that's deliberate. And that's to punish the leaders who are organizing the workers. And the worst part is that you suddenly can find yourself suspended indefinitely. So it's like illegal suspension. The worst, and then it gets even much more deadlier than that, because some workers end up being red tagged in the Philippines and then eventually being assassinated. So I don't know if there's any idea here about what red tagging is. Okay, red tagging essentially is a practice of the military and paramilitary forces in the Philippines where they label a trade unionist or a human rights activist as a terrorist, a member of a terrorist organization, or a member of the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is waging Asia's longest armed insurgency. So the thing is, particularly if you're outside Metro Manila, if you're red tag, that's practically a death warrant for you. Because it means that all the military people out there and the paramilitary forces that work with them, it means that you're open season. They can do anything with you. You get, after being red tag, you get text messages harassing you, threatening you. If you don't stop with that messages, then you get to be visited in your home, where they talk to your husband, your spouse, your wife, your children. Oh, did you know that your parents are involved in this and that and that? Then if that doesn't stop you, that doesn't scare you, you get, they raid your house, they raid your offices, and if that doesn't stop you, they kill you. So 69 trade union leaders have been killed in the Philippines since 2016 up to this year. 69. Not a single case of killing has received any justice at all. And the last one who was killed this year in June is someone who works as a paralegal officer for BPO, for call center agents. His name is Alex Dolorosa. For the first time, the State Department, the US State Department, actually issued a statement on killings. That's great. At least after 68 deaths, there's a statement from the State Department on the 69. And so at least I could be happy that if I get killed, I'll get a statement from the State Department at least. But the case of Alex Dolorosa has yet to be resolved. So nonetheless, and now I'll end with these last few points. Nonetheless, all these workers, the BPO workers and the gig riders, they're trying to organize themselves as a union, and the gig riders are organizing themselves around a charter of rights where they say, essentially, it doesn't matter whether you call us employee or you call us independent contractor, every one of us gets the same rights as everyone else. So that's the kind of organizing that they're doing. But I'd like to end with this crucial point, and this is where I wanted to go back again to our own debates. Remember, Nori, when we were debating with CIO and the other trade, the ICFTU at that time, where they were so concerned about let's have a labor clause. Now it's the same issue again, all over again. So the question that's we're still trying to grapple with is that should we even have a labor clause inside? Which is a very democratic idea, to be honest, a labor clause protecting workers' rights. Should we even have that clause in an entire trade agreement that's completely undemocratic? That it's undemocratic not only because you don't have any negotiating rights, you don't have any information, it's being done in secret, as was explained, and Dory will obviously explain more of how secretive it is. Oh, we've heard it from the Congresswoman herself. Reading the text is key. That's new. That's incredibly new for me. So it's undemocratic in that sense, but it's also very undemocratic because you can have a good agreement, but you have this agreement with this labor clause. But then what if it completely hollows out the entire livelihood of people because it decimates the jobs, the industries, and the sector you work in? That's still the problem for us. Now, last word. I promise this is my last word. We have failed in stopping many of the free trade agreements that my government got into. We have delayed many of them, but we have failed to stop them, and that has led to the opposite of what they promised. Rather than industrialization, we had deindustrialization. Rather than agricultural development, we have an agricultural crisis today. Now, but the only good news I'd like to leave this you with is that in RCEP, the government finally had RCEP ratified after being delayed for many years. But so we failed again. Sorry, Lori. But the good news is that we had in the resolution of this of the ratification of RCEP a line where the Senate finally agreed that there should be a Senate Oversight Committee on the RCEP, which would then allow us to monitor whether RCEP would actually deliver, and then yank it off if it doesn't. I think that's one thing that we should continue working on, especially as we go into IMF. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Asha, for taking the time to really explain to us what's going on in the Philippines. That was pretty cool. So our last, but certainly not least, speaker is Lori Wallach, who's the director of the Rethink Trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project. She's the founder and senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign, and a 30-year veteran in international and U.S. correctional trade battles, starting in the 1990s, fights over NAFTA and WTO, and has a vast knowledge of trade policies and outcomes. So really excited to have Lori here today. We flew in from DC, so thanks so much, Lori, for doing.
Well, thank you very much for including me on the panel. Thank you to the whole Washington Fair Trade campaign for organizing this, and the Trade Justice Education Fund for organizing this. And it's really exciting to be on this amazing panel and to have been at the same event as Congressman Jayapal. It's a lot of hard acts to follow, I have to say. I want to pick up where Congressman Jayapal started, which is, it's worth noting that at this point in the US Congress, in a way, they're trying to catch up to what, say, the European Union is already doing, and what's already happening in a bunch of other parts of the world, where, like, Kenya has a great privacy policy, and Malaysia has a better data safety policy. And so the US Congress is starting to pass legislation to deal with the big tech platforms, and the Biden administration is on this mission too. And it covers a lot of stuff: privacy, data security, like for infrastructure, civil rights and civil liberties online discrimination, trying to stop the monopolistic abuses that are happening, trying to figure out how you have labor rights for gig workers, and how they misclassified. They're not really gig workers in the first instance. They're workers who have to work for a digital platform and they're trying to basically be denied their basic rights to organize. All of those threats and problems the US Congress is now chasing after, and the Biden administration is on a mission on, and they've appointed a bunch of really great folks to the Biden administration to deal with this, like Lena Khan, as we heard from the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. And a way to think about this digital trade stuff is basically in the face of finally this coming together and this necessary oversight of the digital economy. The biggest of the tech platforms seeing over their shoulder that we're onto them, and our accountable representatives are starting to think about doing something about their abuses. They're looking for a sneaky way to try and get done what's gotten very hard to do in the sunshine of public debate. So the sort of bullshit factor of, we're not a problem, look the other way, they've kind of lost that argument in Congress. There's nothing going on here, look over there. They're losing that in the regulatory agencies. And so now what this digital trade move is basically taking a brand, digital trade. Does that mean my stuff comes faster when I order it online? No, it does not. It's another misbrand to try and have a backdoor way to do the same thing they've been doing all along, which is just simply to evade oversight and regulation and accountability. And unfortunately, trade talks provide a perfect platform to do this. Now, we have heard they are secrets. It is lunatic, but these trade agreements are classified. That's why the document goes to the SCIF. The Congresswoman only had the half of the story. It is true, she has to march to the SCIF. She didn't mention she has to turn in her phone, pen, and her pad of paper. Can't take notes. And the staff can't come in unless they have security clearance. Like, we're not talking the nuclear codes here. We're talking rules about what's going to happen with big tech and your personal data. So, meanwhile, these big tech lobbyists she mentions, they can look at it online because secret for all of us, but totally rigged advisory system. So if you go to rethinktrade.org, www.rethinktrade.org, we decided to depict this. There's an infographic near the top called Loaded, and it shows in graphic form, like the two Amazon representatives and the Zero Consumer Group representatives. It shows that 84% of the advisors, 84% represent direct corporations or corporate lobby groups. So you can really see the thumb on the scale. Now, thank goodness, there is a labor advisory committee. And God bless those 17 unionists thrown into the piranha pool of all the corporate lobbyists. However, that is, no matter how strong those 17 brothers and sisters of the labor movement are, it is not a fair fight. When there are 500 advisors and there's 17 of them, plus a couple state government folks and academics, it is not a good situation. So very secret, very biased advisory system. And then, if all that weren't sort of problematic enough, you've got a lot of revolving door folks. Now, you've got the Biden administration appointed folks, like the new trade representative. She wants a new digital trade agenda, she wants a new trade agenda. But there are a lot of career folks to go back and forth from having a career job to working for the industry, having a career job, working for the industry. And the trade representatives, the Commerce Department, there are a whole bunch of people who literally were working for Meta, for Google, you name the big companies, those guys go in and out. And so you've got on the inside this team that's like going team status quo. They are going for that cliff. They don't care if that cliff is met, everyone else gets screwed. And then you've got the trade representative trying to turn the ship of state over here. And she gets appointed over here and she goes to like deal with China trade and then team status quo drags it back in that direction. And these career folks know all the details because they've been working inside and outside for the same thing and they know all the lobbyists. It is a mess, which gets to the question of how, if the part of the administration doing all the right things, how the heck do we even have to have this discussion about digital trade? And it is the secrecy, it is the biased advisory groups, and it is the career staff and the revolving door that makes it a constant course correction fight. And then there's all the complicated jargon. So these trade agreements are like written intentionally obliquely, so that it's written in this gobbledygook language where, like, I am a recovering trade attorney. I read the stuff, I go, oh, that's really clever. That is such a screw job. I didn't even think about using that word that way. But for a normal civilian, you look at the word and you think, well, that doesn't seem so bad. It's intentional. It's basically using weaselly words. So those four combinations of things make it really easy to rig a trade agreement, and therefore we are seeing the big tech lobbyists trying to get these digital trade rules, which have nothing to do with trade, into a whole bunch of negotiations. There's a thing called the World Trade Organization Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce. Could not make this crap up. You can't even remember that to know what the thing you're supposed to be mad about. Just remember WTO JSI on digital trade. WTO JSI. That's a global version of these crap rules. Then you've got a US-Taiwan agreement. They're trying to ram the rules in there. There's a Latin America one that the lobbyists are trying to figure out how to get it into. And then this thing is Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That one is the one everyone's paying attention to because it's just coming first. Whichever one of these things comes first is where the cake is going to get cooked. And then it's going to be like a model, and it's going to be harder to change it. Because the Biden administration is doing stuff differently. It is not the same old crappy trade agreements. I can tell you this. I have spent years looking at crappy trade agreements. This is not that. But these digital rules, this is one of those places where the corporate lobbies still think it might get erased. And the issue, I think, in a way that is going on is you've got basically big tech figuring they can use these weaselly words to ban the tools that are needed for oversight. And I want to sort of, add to what Cherika said, which is these Biden trade talks really start from a different place. And I kind of, in it being Seattle, I want to call out what that is, which is folks here, starting with the battle in Seattle in '99, but activists working really hard across the country with their brothers and sisters in other countries, made it such that you can't do those old bad trade agreements. When President Biden said he was doing worker-centered trade agreements, that's because he's a guy who loves unions and working people. But frankly, it would be really hard to do the same old bad trade agreements because activists and advocates and labor unions and environmental groups and faith groups have basically helped educate people in this country. So this IPAF, this Taiwan deal, it does not have those horrible investor-state dispute settlement panels. Ixnay, gone. It does not have service sector privatization. It does not have the crappy big pharma patent extensions jack up medicine prices. It does not have the Buy America ban. It doesn't even have a damn procurement chapter that can go after buy local. Like totally different thing. And why is that? Because we all made that too sticky to be possible. And members of Congress did. And folks like Biden said, this isn't worked out. We're not doing more of this. And so that's the reality. But the thing that no one was paying attention to that only crept up in the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and in the USMCA, the NAFTA replacement, are these bullshit digital rules. And those have not been educated and exposed. So the one thing that could be from the battles, and not even long ago battle, because we've gotten all that stuff out. The one thing that can snuck through is these digital rules. And that I'm going to explain what I think we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. But just to make sure for everyone to really think about what we've achieved, there's a direct path from Seattle in 1999 through people in the US stopping. It made it impossible to get a majority in Congress of TPP. I mean, there are many countries that got sucked into the TPP. But all this activism and advocacy stopped it here. And our Congress said, it's not going to happen. It's not happening. And they wouldn't give a majority. And the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the NAFTA negotiation by far is not perfect because it's got these horrible digital rules. There's some other bad rules. But if you think about that, activism got rid of ISDS. Activism put in for the first trade agreement ever, actual enforceable labor standards. You pulled out the uber crazy patent rules for big pharma that would jack up medicine prices, mainly for Mexico, but with a lot of bad prices in here. A lot of progress got made. And so now we basically have to do the same thing on this digital stuff. Because, what Josua said is, if you've got the underlying rules wrong, then it doesn't matter if the cake is poisonous. It does not matter if you have good frosting, labor standards. If we can take all that bad stuff out, all that corporate deregulation and all the offshoring incentives aren't in this, that we're in NAFTA, that we're in all the bad agreements. That is not what this is. So you've now got a really different fit. And the question is, can we make sure that this digital stuff, which could be like a poisoner, that we make sure that it's not rules in there that limit, that handcuff Congress. Now, there are a bunch of rules in there that are totally kosher. Like, you do need to know what is a legitimate online contract. That is not our concern. That is really a real e-commerce thing. Or what's an online signature? Some of that stuff is legit. The stuff we can't have is all the garbage that's been branded as digital trade that really is just flat out deregulation and locking up Congress. And so the way we get this fixed, basically, is to understand what the pieces are. So the way I would sort of think about it is there are really three main tools that the big tech guys want to make illegal trade barriers, because the trade agreements set binding rules, and then all your domestic laws are supposed to stay within those parameters. So, the way I'm seeing Clayton here is with the Texas Fair Trade campaign, he came up to help make sure this would be live streamed. And so the way I would put it in Texas terms is these rules become like a high voltage cattle fence, barbed wire and high voltage, and they put it right around Congress and the White House. and they say, oh, you think you have, Mr. Biden, this AI Bill of Rights? You can go on the State of the Union, you're going to announce that you're going to have new, and he said the word big tech 3 times. Excellent. Big tech rules to protect children online and protect their privacy. And you think, Congress, you're going to have these anti-monopoly rules for big tech? You just bump right up against our digital trade rules. You're not allowed to cross that line. Oh, you want to come over here, Mr. Federal Trade Commission? You can't make a law that goes up against those rules. So it's basically fencing in the policy space so Congress cannot act, so the administration cannot act. So you've got the administration saying, we're doing an all of government competition policy. No more monopolies. And they're taking buttons, taking names. If these rules go into place, they run right up into the fence. So our trick is to make sure that none of those rules, that again, nothing to do with trade, end up slimed into a trade agreement. It's like a classic Trojan horse maneuver. You use lots of branding, you have basically a different name, so it's not clear what it is, and then you hope no one finds out. So the punchline is, how do we fix this? It's back to all of the work folks in Seattle did during the big fight that won over the multilateral agreement and investment, another thing that activists killed. It's the Dracula strategy. We just need to drag it into the sunshine. So the good news is there are tons of materials to unpack this. It doesn't have to be all these complicated details. So again, at www.rethinktrade.org, you've got everything from the AFL-CIO's amazing paper on digital economy, workers' rights, and a worker-centered digital trade agenda. So this lays out, as Cherika was explaining, how you do it right versus how you do it wrong. You've got everything from our full-length reports, and the Congresswoman would be proud to know she gave me some marching orders 2 months ago, which is to do a side-by-side of all the U.S. laws and administration proposals, side-by-side with the bad trade rules. We did that. Rethinktrade.org, ladies and gentlemen. You can side-by-side see Congressman Jayapal's bill, but all of them, the ban on facial recognition, the national privacy rules, our body, our data, all of the best proposals, and then which one of these proposed rules could clobber. Because as the Congressman laid out, there's the secrecy rule, which would make AI oversight impossible, make it impossible to figure out all the civil rights and civil liberties violations and algorithms that Jen was talking about. You've got the rules that basically ban what would be basically anti-monopoly rules. And just to give you a concrete example, and this is with Joshua in mind, in the Philippines, before Uber got knocked out, a couple of Philippine cities were trying to regulate ride sharing. And their basic rule was, this is very inventive, we don't care if you're a taxi company with brick and mortar, you're online, here are the rules. Certain hours of service, certain rules, you have to do social security, whatever. The rules would be the same. And Uber came in and said, you're not allowed to do that. That's trade discrimination because it's going to hit us harder. And the city's government said it's not aimed at because you're American. You're an American company. That's not what we're aiming at. It hits you harder because you're big, not because you're American. Because you're the monopolist in the market, it hits you bigger because you're bigger, not because you're American. If these rules that the Congressman was talking about end up in IPAF or in the Taiwan agreement, WTO agreement, stuff like that, that's facially neutral. It just says, here's the labor rights rule. Here's the health rule. Here's what we do if you get too big, we break you up. It doesn't matter if it's neutral, if it hits an American company more than it hits a local company, it's deemed an illegal trade barrier. Of course, every anti-monopoly policy targets the big companies, which means basically the big companies, which are either at this moment US or Chinese, you could not regulate because they are bigger, not because they are from the US or China. So with those kind of tools in place, you'd be in big trouble. So getting the word out is really important. And the good news is you've got this Biden administration in the right place. You've got a lot of the negotiators aware of it in the US. The bad news is you still do have the secrecy, the revolving door, the corporate lobbyists. And I'm sad to say not all the members of Congress are like Congresswoman Jayapal. Number one, some of them are clueless. She's way on top of it, God bless her. But we need to get the word out to the folks on the city council, to the mayor's office, to the state AG, to the governor's office, to the entire congressional delegation. And then there are a couple of those members of Congress from the Washington state that need a course correction. I am very sad to say that Congresswoman Del Bene is leading the other side. So you've got one of the leaders leading for the right thing on this fight, and then you have Congresswoman Suzanne Del Bene, Democrat, leading in the wrong direction. And she literally chairs a thing called the Digital Trade Working Group. And they are pushing for these rules. So here, again, getting the word out, getting trainings organized. I just want to volunteer because I know they do them all the time. The Washington State Fair Trade Campaign Coalition can do a lot of great educational work. We also have slides on our website if you want to take a try of it yourself and use all these materials. There's everything from the 2-page version of that long technical side-by-side. This is boiled down to 2 pages. You have to see all the legislative language. Or if you have someone who doubts you, we have all the great details. Plus, we put all the best stuff from all of our friends and partners, like the AFL-CIO there. We can get the right rules, and that will set a new model, and we can help deliver, as the Congresswoman said, the new vision that the Biden administration, that a lot of Democrats in Congress, Suzanne Government accepted, have in mind. But it's not going to happen unless we help make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all our incredible comments. Please join me in another round of applause. Discussion we having right now. Again, this is a really unusual time, and the important thing to do right now is to move the word out. So as Lori mentioned, rethinktrade.org. You can also follow the Washington Fair Trade Coalition on Facebook and Twitter, or go to tradejusticeedfund.org to get more information. They also host monthly activist calls where we go through, how to really bring this out in the shadows. Thank you all so much. I know we've gone a bit over. If anyone has any questions, we can take a couple here. But again, thank you all so much for being here and being part of this really important discussion. It does take all of you to really bring this up in the shadows. So does anyone have any questions for our panelists?
I have a question about the actual language in IPEP. It's my understanding that in the previous APEC meeting, there really wasn't a lot of things put out there because of our pushback. But because this is the digital, this is the place for them to talk digital stuff. San Francisco is only a few months away, and will we have time to see what their sort of results from here in time to react to them in San Francisco? I guess I'm concerned about the timing here.
You want to take other questions, or should we answer them one by one? So the process is a little murky, and it's a perfect question. The probability is that the whole digital chapter may not be done. The target time to try and finish these negotiations is at a meeting here in the middle of November. Yeah, in San Francisco, not here, but in the US, I shouldn't say here, in the United States. And the rounds of negotiations that are slated include a round in Thailand for September, a round in Malaysia for October, and then in November in San Francisco, and then perhaps signing. But what they're going to be able to sign or what they're going to finish is a little bit unclear. Because so far, the good news is, for instance, the Biden administration has gotten stronger labor standards, but they're not enforceable yet. So they may have finished that chapter. The environmental chapter still needs a lot of work. It doesn't mention the word climate, which is a problem. The digital chapters become so controversial, mainly because people across Congress and around the country are starting to realize there's a rat. They're starting to push back. But also some other countries, for instance, in New Zealand, there is a treaty that protects the rights of the Maori indigenous people. There was a Supreme Court case there that basically showed past trade agreements have violated the treaty rights on privacy. So, for instance, New Zealand can't have the corporations own all the data rule that has been, for instance, in the USMCA or the TPP that the US used to push, but the US is even starting to modify. So with all of these pieces in the air, it's unclear that they're going to get the labor chapter, the environment chapter, or the digital chapters done. Most of what's in IPAP has nothing to do with any of those kind of rules. Most of it is things like infrastructure and climate investment, or good governance, trying to avoid international tax evasion and money laundering. So a bunch of that stuff, which is a fine set of things to talk to with your neighbors and friends, is a fine thing that might get done by San Francisco. But some of these harder things, unclear. And part of the way we will decide if we avoid bad rules getting put in, or we push to get the right rules and create a good new model and start a whole new page going forward, which is the goal, is how much we are able to educate, inform, and basically have conversations going with many elected officials so that they are then talking to the negotiators. And as well, there's a lot of great work being done with international partners to do the same thing. So hopefully they're getting to their negotiators. If it all comes to pass in November, we wouldn't have time. So part of what we need to do is basically make sure we get the right kind of agreement, even if that takes longer.
Thanks so much. We're going to for one more question.
Are looking at the dialogue answer and the response can you speak and
The two Washington State senators have not been, I would say, helpful on this issue. They're not necessarily in the camp of Del Bene, who is in the category of actively advocating for the wrong stuff. But the senators have not been on the team of folks who are fighting for the right rules. I mean, interestingly, what's kind of happened is it was the members of the House and Senate who were fighting for the good digital regulatory bills, Democrats and Republicans alike, who first woke up to this because they sort of saw over their shoulder. For instance, a bunch of corporations started saying, Korea's App Store law, that's an illegal trade barrier. And then Congressman Blumenthal and his Republican, Senator Blumenthal and his Republican co-sponsor said, we based our use bill on the Korea App Store bill, which is just a rule that says basically the duopoly that controls app stores, Apple and Google, cannot just charge whatever they want as take. You should be able to pay on other settlement systems, not just their settlement systems. So they can't take money from the app developer or charge you an extra fee. So if you want to pay on Zelle or whatever you want to pay on, you can pay on. It's not just a monopoly. Or they used to say you can only pick one or the other app developer. You can't list on both. So those kind of rules to make it more fair in app stores. And so those senators started saying, wait a minute, our bill is the Korean bill. Or there's a bill in the US called the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, JCPA. And that bill basically makes the big tech platforms negotiate with the newspapers and journalism content providers to compensate. Because right now they make a lot of money in the advertising, they don't pay for the content. And that's basically a bill that already is enacted in Australia and Canada. So they saw the corporate guys going, that's going to be a digital trade violation. You can't do that. And then Senator Klobuchar and her Republican counterparts went, wait a minute, we're doing the same thing here. So the people who really first realized the backdoor sneak attack are the people whose actual legislation, based on other countries' legislation, or Senator Warren saw the European Digital Markets Act, the DMA attack, and said, wait, a lot of my anti-monopoly before somebody's on that. And so the Washington State senators haven't been a problem, but they have not been allied. We should not.
Thank you so much. We'll end it here for today. Thank you all again for participating in this discussion. There's so much more to say, but again, please go to those resources we listed, Rethink.org, the Trade Ed Fund, and the Washington Fair Trade Coalition for more information. And we'll surely be hosting more conversations like this one. Thank you again for amazing panelists and to you all for being here today.